Well, this is like first, well, I mean, it's
This
kind
is
of like
exactly.
the triage is going to take a while because you don't have that backup question. And kind of what we talked about in the earlier panel about paying back some IOUs. What's hard with Oroville and Folsom Storage is you can maybe work a little bit there to deal with delta pumping and some of that aspect, but it's really hard then to back up the water into storage because for both Oroville and Folsom, as we get into the fall, we're talking about really low flow rates. So you can't cut back on those more and say, oh, we'll use Shasta at that point, because we're talking maybe 500 CFS, 800 to 500 CFS out of at Nimbus is really low, and the state's talking about some really low numbers on the Feather as well.
Sobering. Thank you. Very important. Next, before we get to our next panel, I have a couple of requests. I'm going to move now to Louis Bear for the Sacramento River Settlement Contractors. Mr. Bear, are you coming by yourself, or are you going to bring Mr. Guy or anyone else with you? Great. Yeah, you can have Ron back if you want. Ron will be everybody's buddy. Or 5. Well, how much do you need? There you go. Impressive.
So thanks for the opportunity. Today, my name is Louis Bear. I'm the manager for Sacramento River Settlement Contractor District, Reclamation District 108, and so I can speak specifically to what we're doing, but as well to the settlement contractors as a whole. The first thing I would like to do is to represent all the actions that we're doing. We're doing a lot. I understand other folks are in a very, very difficult situation, but I want you to know that the Sacramento settlement contractors aren't saying that this is somebody else's issue and we're going to be fine. So as you know, we have a 75% allocation as we did last year. Last year we took actions and actually reduced that to about 60% of our diversions, so we actually didn't divert 75. So this year we have taken that even further, and our expectation is we'll divert somewhere around 50%, maybe a little less than that. We are actively scheduling our diversions with the Bureau of Reclamation. We have a schedule. We're sticking to that. We have a weekly conference call and then usually a couple after that to work through issues. But we actually are well below, and like projected, I said, at about 50%. Some of the actions that the districts have taken, just as a reminder, we have moved about 200,000 acre feet out of these summer months through a transfer program that we did to try to make the last program work. So for RD 108, that's about a third of our rice acres, or about 8,500 acres that are fallow in our district. And at last week's board meeting, kind of in response to the new plan, we have taken a suite of additional actions to try to support the existing plan that's being proposed. So our district in new actions has eliminated the use of water for anything but existing crops. So many folks right now are planning on double cropping, and that's not happening. And so you can imagine those phone calls. So there'll be no additional water use in our districts to anything that's not already in the ground. Our district also initiated a groundwater program, and you'll see that there are very similar, or I'd like to speak, I guess, a little bit for the other districts, the other settlement contractors. They're all doing the same types of actions, but we've initiated a groundwater program. So there was already a groundwater program, but any additional wells that exist in the valley that would help us reduce diversions from the Sacramento River, we are taking that action to put those into play. So essentially everything is on the table for us at this point, and I think we've done everything that we can possibly do other than starting to kill crops. So anyway, those are the actions that we've taken to this point, and I just wanted to make sure everybody knew that those things are happening. The second thing I wanted to mention is we continue to use Dave Vogel, our fisheries biologist, and Dave has put together a memo that we've shared with the fishery agencies on ways that we believe that we can take actions to help mitigate some of the impacts to fish. And we continue to work with the fishery agencies. Next week, some of us are meeting with Cal Fish and Wildlife Service up in Redding to talk about how we can contribute to that effort. So we also understand that this whole system is tied together. I would share with you that right now the Sacramento River obviously is very low. I don't know if you guys check Wilkins Slough water levels as much as I do, but it's extremely low. Our pumps are probably in the, certainly within a foot of being out of the water, and we'd lose irrigation capacity to thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of acres in our district. But I'd also like to express the concern that in the upcoming month or so, I think we'll pass through a critical period, and that critical period is, we talk about depletions, but that critical period is not necessarily a function of changes in diversion by the settlement contractors. It's kind of changes in the system, either increased losses from the Sacramento River or reduced inflow from the Sacramento River. That can be 300 or 400 CFS from looking at last year. I think when we look at the graphs or the plan for that matter, and we look at a flat line for the whole year, and many of us say, well, we need some additional flows to prop that plan up. Most of us aren't thinking, or at least the Sac River settlement contractors don't immediately see that as a blanket across all months to achieve that, but that there may be a very critical period for a couple of weeks. So, maybe it's 200 CFS for a couple of weeks or 500 CFS for a couple of weeks on the extreme side. That, maybe talking about 10,000 acre feet. Just as we heard earlier, once you kill a fish, same thing applies if you kill a crop. If you go a week or two without water, doesn't really matter what happens on the other side. So I just asked the board to keep that in consideration and to look at the impacts to fish, not on a 3-month basis, but on a, what if we just had 10 days of higher flows? Would that create a substantial impact and include that flexibility in the system?
What's that critical time frame? At what point have you lost that opportunity?
So I'm worried about this heat spell that's coming up right now, but I think it's the next 3 weeks. I think it's through mid-July. So we start to have crops shut off about that time. So, and then there were some questions earlier about Painter's Riffle and the salmon recovery program for Naquah, and we will certainly continue those projects. I spend, somewhere 40% of my time right now pursuing that Ninth Landing outfall gates project to try to protect these fish that we're hoping survive out now when they return. So we'll continue with that program. We also will continue cooperating with certainly the fishery agencies and the Bureau to make sure that this plan holds up.
Quick question. Thank you for the comprehensive report. You mentioned about 8,500 acres of rice are fallowed in RD 108, and you said that was a percentage of the rice crop.
So it's about a third of RD 108's rice crop. So I think overall there's about 60,000 acres that was fallowed.
Thank you.
Which is a little over 10%.
So did I hear an ask there of like a little pulse flow on top of the base flow?
Yeah, I think
benefit the crops.
Yeah, so I think we've looked at everything kind of fairly simply as kind of covering the whole year, and that's probably for us and from our position not necessarily what's needed. It may just be a few weeks.
Thank you, and thanks for all the pitching in that you and the other settlement contractors and the growers in the area are doing.
And I apologize because I made a quick run to the restroom there, so could you provide, or have you already provided information here on the impact if you don't get that additional flexibility? What does that mean in terms of not just a reduction in water supply, but crops that have already been planted?
Yeah, so specifically for RD 108, we have 2 pumping plants. And I think right now there's 1 pumping plant's the only possible water supply for about 12,000 acres. And I think we're probably 5 inches or so of river elevation from losing that pumping plant. So I think, you know, if that lasted for a week or so, we would lose the crops in that area.
How many acres?
12,000.
And you're in constant conversation, I'm taking it, with the Bureau and fish agencies. I would just want to add thank you for all the actions over the years and your attitude, and you and your colleagues. It's really impressive and something I tell a lot of people about whenever I get the chance. So really, really appreciate it. These things are hard, and it makes it easier when folks are trying to help us figure it out. So appreciate it.
No problem. It helps to my my kids' humor, and they laugh about my shiny hair. So thank you very much.
Thanks. All right, before the panel, I have some people who need to leave, so I'm going to go to 3-minute comments. I have 3 of them. First is John McManus with the Golden Gate Salmon Association. Did I lose him? All right, I'll hold it. Maybe he had to go. Tim Sloan from PCFFA. Did I lose them all? I said I had till 3. Mike Hudson. All right, 3 fishermen. Maybe they'll be back. Maybe they're out in the hall. If you see them. So let's move to the next panel. That is the San Joaquin Irrigation District's 20 minutes. David Weisenberger, the General Manager of Banta Carbona Irrigation District, John Azevedo, President of the Patterson Irrigation District, and Robert Pierce, General Manager, West Stanislaus Irrigation District.
Good afternoon, Chair Marcos, members of the board, Karna Herigfeld, counsel for the districts. Since you did such a wonderful job of introducing them, I will defer that. Dave Weisenberger is going to speak first, and then Bobby Pierce and John Acevedo is going to follow it up. So go ahead, you guys.
All right. Good afternoon. My name is David Weisenberger. I am the General Manager of Banta Carbona Irrigation District from Tracy, California. Banta Carbona is a CBP contractor south of Delta on the Delta-Mendota Canal. The Delta-Mendota Canal runs from Jones Pumping Plant in Tracy down to San Luis Reservoir, 75-mile-long canal. We're within the first 21 miles of it. We're also, I'm sitting here today with a curtailment letter from Mr. Howard. I'm also a San Joaquin River diverter. And so I sit here.
You have the whole suite. Do you have groundwater too?
Pardon me?
Do you have groundwater too?
Yeah, very little, just a tiny.
No, but that's good as a manager.
So we're looking at these curtailments, and so the Shasta River temperature plan comes into play now for us. We have water stored from previous years' conservation efforts and groundwater storage, and now it's becoming inaccessible if Jones Pumping Plant isn't going to run. So that's why Banta Carbona is here and my fellow associates. Yes, and I'm going to be the first to use the word balancing from after your comment. I recognize and I see for sure, I understand what the fishery agencies presented. There's no doubt that if the temperatures change, there's dead fish. I'm not going to dispute that. I'm not going to dispute their science. I think but to use the term balancing, I think we're talking. Well, I'm in favor for the temperature plan that was approved in May. That would at least provide for some subsistence pumping at Jones to facilitate the exchanges of water that we have in San Luis with others that have water and that would be using the pumped water. Thus, we need that to Jones to provide some of that subsistence pumping. Otherwise, if we can't do that, then we will be without water because that was our backup plan. And we realized the possibility of this happening back in December. Our board of directors are very wise men, and they says, well, what if Jones doesn't run? And so all winter, we contemplated that and had discussions with the Water Authority about what would be some options. We really got into it very deeply in April, looking at alternatives. How do you get this water back? Well, at the same time, you folks were in reviewing the TUCP from the Bureau of Reclamation. And as that was progressing, it looked more and more, and we were in constant contact with Mr. Milligan, that it came to a point that, hey, things are going to operate similarly to the way Jones operated last summer on this TUCP. So at that point, alternatives that were going to be very difficult to get in place anyway slowed way down because we felt we had an assurance because based on earlier, like board member Dodek mentioned earlier, let's use the latest information we have to base our decisions from this day forward. Well, the latest information we had was the TUCP on May 4th or whatever, and then the approval of the temperature control plan on May 14th. So okay, curtailment letter, we'll deal with curtailments. We've got a backup source, we'll deal with that. So here's the balancing. This is, we're to a point now, I know for sure you're not going to like my balancing from what I've heard today. Because I'm not a fish expert, but I do enjoy reading history, and I do enjoy trying to understand the problems we face as an irrigation district. I mean, we know fish is always going to be a part of the equation in water, surface water deliveries. So looking at fisheries and reading up a little bit on them, that we learned that, I disagree with Mr. Bobker's presentation that there's only 3 and 4-year-olds. That's the life cycle of a salmon. I've read that the life cycle of a natural salmon is 1 to 8 years. I mean, they've had to do that because California had droughts before we got here, and they had long ones. So how did they survive? They missed classes, and they missed certain times of year, in my mind. To me, that's common sense. And so if you miss this year's class, you know, if they get toasted, to use your terms, I mean...
Shouldn't have used that term.
Well, I think it's accurate. I mean, if they get toasted this fall, yeah, that's a disaster. We lost 1 year. But Mother Nature didn't have them relying on 1 year's class. She had an 8-year span. She taught them, or whatever she is, to stay in the ocean and come in at different times so they could prevent these kind of disasters. So I think, so I'm asking you to ride further on the razor's edge because I think the choice is today, it's a policy question. We know if we don't get water, this last little bit incremental water to certain folks, farmers are going to get toasted. We know that up front because you can't get the water. So that's on one side. And the other side is there's the possibility if you release a little bit of water over the summer to maintain some Jones pumping, to accommodate exchanges and et cetera, and to meet some of these other folks' concerns like at Folsom and et cetera, where they're not on the razor's edge either, you do run the risk. I see that. You run the risk of losing a whole class in this section of the river. The other thing that baffles me when I hear, is that the only place winter run Chinook salmon are spawning on the Sacramento River system? I know, I may have this wrong, but I know you earlier this year you were talking about creeks. Dry Creek, or not, well maybe it was Dry Creek, and some other creeks. Maybe that was a different run of salmon, but I mean, I'm under the impression that these salmon have different tributaries on the Sacramento River for winter run. And so I believe that you folks are overstressing on Mother Nature's ability to sustain a salmon run. I understand this is the 3rd year and they have been under duress. But I think Mother Nature can overcome that. So I'm asking you to run further at the razor's edge and to lean to talk about the balancing. There's just under half of the reservoir is about half full right now. To increase to the temperature plan you approved in May, you're talking about 155,000 acre feet being released over the next 2 months. That's 7% of what's in storage right now. The other 93% is to preserve cold water storage, use it for whatever purpose you need. So that's my ask. And I'll turn it over to Bobby.
Maybe I'll save it. I have a question based on that.
Yeah, sure.
Well, it's actually for these guys. The issue of the Jones, and Jones being shut, so transfers can't happen. Can you explain that?
Sure. Oh,
Or whoever wants to explain. No, I want them to explain.
oh, your staff. Oh,
Yes.
It just becomes, capacity issues if they're not doing any pumping, and Jones provides water to some locations that you can't get through the other facilities. And I think that's why, I'm not sure who mentioned it this morning, in terms of getting water to like City of Tracy and things like that. They're actually talking about putting in pumps and things like that to get water to some locations.
And
think
tell me
some
again
of-
why
some of-
Jones isn't pumping. We haven't talked about that.
I think some of this is also planned transfers from Northern California potentially too, correct?
I think that's coming up on the next panel. Mine is for exchanges between Tracy and San Luis Reservoir to use their water and the water I have stored in San Luis for them to use. Lost my train of thought on your Jones.
You can't get the water that you have unless it can be pumped
Right.
from, there's no way physically for you to get it from San Luis other than through
Except for the
exchanges.
alternative that Mr. Grover just alluded to, that we are working to try to get a pump back system installed. But right now, we're stuck in a hard spot because if we're off now and the pump back system's in 2 to 3 weeks, we have the same problem that the fish, Mr. Bobker mentioned about fish, and what Louis Bear just said,
This is the
once it's
period.
dead, it's dead. So anyways, so there's a sense of urgency.
Could you tell us what your situation is as far as how many acres, what percentage you thought you were getting back in May,
Well,
May
our-
20th versus what you'd be getting now, and also abandoned acres as far as crops that have already been planted?
Well, we serve about 17 to 18,000 acres. Not all of those are planted this year because we knew we were in a drought. Basically, if we honor the curtailment request and we have the temperature shasta thing, then that's a zero water supply. So basically, it's all lost. Everything. I mean, I was serious. We have very little groundwater. We got like 10 CFS well for the 17,000 acres. I mean, that's.
But did anybody plant anything in reliance of the temperature, the temporary temperature plan?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes,
so
because
that's my question. How many acres do you have planted, and what is the result if we end up with the current framework of 7250?
Well, two parts of that. All the row crop, I don't have that acreage figure right in front of me, the row crop acreage, which would be, was relying on that because of the supplemental supply we had. So basically, we informed our growers at the end of April when things were getting solidified on the most recent information. So people that planted tomatoes or tomatoes is probably pretty much the one. And people that had alfalfa, then that's a perennial type crop, so that was already in the ground. There weren't any new alfalfa fields put in the last year or two. So I'm afraid, so I don't have the number that you're looking for.
I'll be asking each one of you that and anybody else that's coming up, so it'd be good if you could give an estimate, and if not, then hopefully
Well,
our
I'll
staff
just
can
say,
collect it.
Our estimate in our declaration and our recent action was that if by having no water and the loss of everything, we figured there was an $800 million impact in the short and long term. Because once you lose it all and you lose your permanent crops, they have to be replanted, and you've lost all those income years. So 800 million?
Right, but some of this was already known. For example, curtailments, and in my mind, there's a difference between you being notified in February that you're likely to be curtailed because of your status, your junior status, or wherever you are in the water rights seniority system, and also having been notified of that last year, versus getting information from the Bureau in May and then acting in reliance on that. So I'm just trying to hone in on that impact.
Well,
Additional dollars that went into the ground that you won't be able to complete your crop.
I'd say we don't have that number because we did our water planning for the year, and we announced to everyone, in April, our growers, that we were fairly confident of getting having access to our supplemental water, our stored water.
And does the stored water cover?
It was an
Everything.
allocation. People were going to be ratcheted back for the summer to make ends meet. And so we told them what amount of water they could probably count on, and they had to make their decisions on how much to plant based on what we told them at the end of April. So.
Chair Marcus, how much water do you have in San Luis that you're concerned it would be stranded there?
Well, we want it, let's see, right around, I think it's around 18,000 acre feet.
I think for overall DMC purpose, upper DMC purposes, it's about 83,000.
For what purposes?
Upper Delta Mendota Canal use.
And what districts does that account for?
Well, that includes Bannock-Carbona, Patterson Irrigation District, West Stanislaus, and others. We represent about 50% of the upper DMC service area.
Okay, and it includes Del Parto, I assume? Okay.
And just another question, excuse me. It's my
Please,
understanding
this
that
is to
about
eliminate.
300 CFS of Jones pumping would be adequate for the purposes that you need
That's
to
what
transfer that water?
That's what the operators, the San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority, has evaluated and believed to be the number. That's correct.
Thank you.
What was the number? I didn't catch that.
If Jones pumps about 300 CFS, that'll allow them to access the water out of the DMC, to transfer water from San Luis Reservoir up the DMC to the lands that, the people who had bought that water.
I sense a follow-up conversation in your future. Let's get the whole picture.
I don't know what else to add to that, Dave. You covered it. You covered it all. I kind of put together some numbers collectively based on the district, on all three districts represented here today. Collectively, we serve roughly 48,698 acres. We divert off the San Joaquin River, and we also have CVP contracts for delivery off the upper DMC. A total of about 59% of the total acres within our districts, or 29,000 acres, are planted in permanent crop. Dave did a good job covering the planning that took place to get to where we are today. There was, and that's not just planning this year, this was planning that took place last year and the subsequent years, and conservation efforts and trying to conserve and to store as much water as possible to make that available through the upper DMC through an exchange for water that's held in San Luis Reservoir. Specifically for West Stanislaus, this happened last year. You curtailed the district's diversion off to San Joaquin in early June of last year. At that time, you suggested that we look for alternative supplies. We did that, made those supplies available in San Luis Reservoir. We took delivery of those supplies off the upper DMC through minimal operations at Jones Pumping Plant. And this was last year at a point where Shasta's storage was roughly 300,000 acre feet lower than where we sit today. And now this year, you curtailed all three of the districts and again told us to look for alternative supplies. We did that not only this year, but in subsequent years, conserving water, placing that water into San Luis Reservoir for later delivery on the upper DMC. Now, where we sit today, there's no certainty that we're going to get that water back. As Dave alluded to earlier, in May, there was a decision point when the TUCP was provisionally approved. At that point, districts on their own said, okay, this is how much water we can allocate to our growers. We, in turn, allocated that water. And subsequently, the growers made their decisions to plant additional crops based on the allocations they're given. Went through, planted those crops, made the purchases, procurements necessary to grow them to where they are today, and that overall that's about a cost of roughly $31 million. And that's where we're sitting today with no certainty that we're going to be able to finish out those crops. The economic loss associated with not delivering to the permanent crops is tremendous. We're looking at an economic loss of roughly $2.6 billion just within the 3 districts alone, and that's based on data provided by UC Davis. And again, taking into account, we just represent about 50% of the service area of the DMC. So there's a whole another 50,000 acres that we're talking about, and who are in dire risk of losing their crops and losing very precious water that they've spent a lot of money on and hardships just acquiring.
Can you help me a little bit? This may help me understand some of the numbers that have been floating around in the last couple of days that are so much higher than the entire loss last year. It's because you assume a loss of a tree, and then it takes a number of years to get a new tree in the ground and bearing fruit. So that's where that multiplier, I was trying to figure out where, I was going to ask someone where that number came from.
Yeah,
so
and that's a
helping me
UC Davis
understand it.
multiplier that we're using. And then in our case, it's based on the assumption that they would not replant either. Because if they are going to lose it, over this type of situation, I don't know how much faith they'd have in their surface water supply in the future, and they would have to weigh that. But the numbers are based on not replanting it.
But I think it's also related to money that went into the ground, whereas in other areas where you're going to be cut, of course there are impacts to because of permanent crops, but for those that are planting row crops, they don't invest further, so they're impacted, but up to a point. And in these areas, there might be, for example, somebody that plants tomatoes in reliance on what they thought they were going to get, and going halfway through with their investment, and now they can't finish it.
And they're probably mostly through by now. They've got probably most of the costs into it by now, because like Lewis alluded to earlier, I mean, crops are earlier this year, and we're looking at the next month is a big month, July. So
the $2.6 billion that I mentioned, that is based on an average tree life of 8 years old and a 25-year production life, and based on not replanting, because if we can't serve the water this year, then there's no certainty we're going to be able to serve it next year.
How long have those trees been in? Is there an average amount?
Yeah, so that number was based on an 8-year-old average tree.
Right. I mean, but have they been in a year or 2 years or 3 years or?
No, that's what he means. Okay. He's assuming they've been in the ground 8 years.
8 years.
Oh, they've been in 8 years.
Yeah.
8 years.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Chair Marcus, I had a question.
No, please, that's what we're here for.
So my understanding was that at best, the assumption was that about 1,000 CFS of Jones pumping might be possible, and that was kind of optimistic under the previous plan that was adopted. And that's about 60,000 acre feet a year, but I was under the impression that all of that was going to the exchange contractors. But I guess, are you telling us that some of that was also going to the upper DMC contractors?
No, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is the water going by us, we would take, and they would take our water, the exchange contractors would get our water out of the reservoir.
Sure. So if you could access your water in the reservoir by back pumping it,
right,
then
that's
the issue.
Yes.
Just wanted to clarify.
But back pumping is not an option right now. Is that what you were alluding to? Well, currently we do not have a plan in place to pump water backwards. If we're shut off from we're already shut off from the river. If we're shut off from the DMC today, we're done. We're out of water.
Right, and I heard there wouldn't be time to do it anyway, so.
No.
No.
Tremendous amount of planning that's going into pumping backwards on the DMC, and it's amazing how quickly we think it's going to move, but there's a tremendous effort that's going into it, and numerous agencies involved, and a lot of approvals. So we're not close yet. So yeah, we're not holding our hats on pumping back.
Has it been done before?
No.
What was the last question?
Has it been done before?
No, has not been done before, but there is an action plan in place that's being we're proceeding on to that end, to try to attempt to get the pumping plants in place and try to get water back. But that's weeks away.
Right,
Okay.
that's what I heard you say.
Okay.
Mr. Milligan, do you want to illuminate a little bit, and then we'll continue with the panel?
Yeah, sure. We've been meeting with the authority and the districts, and it's true that if we actually had a little episode here recently trying to meet the outflow objective for June, and had, we were right on the edge in terms of, and really had to juggle the Jones pumping to be able to kind of keep things watered up in the upper part of the canal system to make this work. With the current plan, and this is really predicated both on the depletion patterns in general, which Lewis kind of alluded to, as well as the releases potentially out of Folsom, which we've talked about that a little bit, that we think there'd be enough water to pump, the 250 to 300 CFS that we need, at least particularly till mid-June if that got really tight, and then we could probably rely on at least some pump back, uphill through the canal system. So, we really don't see an example right now where we're at zero unless something else goes on us, like delta salinity, for example, could be very tight. So I do think we'll find a way through this particular example. Actually, we're trying to work with the State Water Project where they'd actually pump for us at Banks and then move this through the intertie over to the DMC. That's really not a net change, but I think it's probably a little more efficient for us. But I think we'll have enough water to get here. I think one of the concerns is that this is another one of those that's right on the edge, obviously. If we get into a really warm or really hot weak spell and the inflows into the delta drop off significantly, then I think that we're going to be struggling with outflow salinity. And, frankly, this same question comes up on South Bay Aqueduct with the State Water Project. Where does that come from? And I think that the response is going to have to be a Folsom Oroville release that's maybe a little beyond what we've currently got as just as a placeholder estimate for the plan. Again, it's probably a short-lived thing, and we could probably survive that. But this was in the range of what we could have been working on in terms of the temperature planning. There were some scenarios where we were probably at zero, and this really heightened the concern about a pump back program. The 7250 is like right on the edge that allows us to keep the pumping going.
And I think you said mid-June. You meant mid-July, right?
I'm sorry, mid-July in terms
Okay, thanks.
of
Well, that makes me feel a little better because I was already, okay.
Are you counting on are you counting on an analysis of the voluntary curtailment in the Delta? That issue that Folsom was talking about? Is everybody counting on that?
Well, I think everybody, from a project standpoint, always, I think that, whatever we can reasonably accommodate there will be helpful. That will allow us to keep these types of things in play, which is just enough water to allow for the exchanges on its edge, and then allow us to then keep water upstream so we're not in that conflict. But if we start earmarking that, then that becomes a little more difficult. If we say there is an adjustment there, but we shall back that up into a particular reservoir, does that then leave us a lack of flexibility to deal with this? Which could, again, I think it's the timing question. We kind of think between now and mid-July, not June, July, that this is going to be our tightest time for our agricultural community. So enough flexibility there to deal with that and then maybe back off as we get into later July and June or August potentially, I think is going to be of a great help. We're probably on week to 2 week bases in terms of where the cropping and the harvest come in.
So that's my big ask coming out of this, is to allow reclamation the operational flexibility that allows no less than 300 CFS at Jones throughout the summer. So.
You really need it throughout the summer. I thought that.
I think the critical time for us would probably be 250 to 300, at least till mid-July. I think once we turn that corner, that's probably not going to be quite the issue. But I think as it relates to keeping the most critical part of the upper DMC, this is the time frame that's probably most critical for us. As we get into August, I don't think August is going to be that difficult to maintain at least the minimal pumping on the upper DMC. You know, like so many of this, July was, you know, obviously going to be our tightest month.
Sorry, you didn't get a chance.
Thank you, Chairwoman Marcus and State Board, for giving me the opportunity to speak today. My name is John Azevedo. I'm president of the Patterson Irrigation District. I'm a third-generation dairy farmer with my 2 sons. As a PID Board of Director, we have done our due diligence and planned for what we thought was the worst-case scenario: curtailment of our pre-1914 water rights by storing pre-1914 water in the San Luis Reservoir. On May 14th, we were assured that that stored water would be accessible by the State Board. That stored water by no means makes us whole. It means a very limited amount of water available to our water users, and based on that, plans were made, some land was fallowed, growers planted crops that required less water in hope that they could make the best of a bad situation. Then on May 29th, the rug was pulled out from underneath us. Mr. Howard reversed that decision on May 14th, the May 14th decision, because of faulty temperature information from the Bureau of Reclamation and the fault of the state not having independent numbers to verify those at the time. In my business, we get no do-overs. I can't unplant a crop. Defaulting on a crop loan is not an option. As a dairyman, I cannot starve a profit out of my cows. When fishery representatives are asked of the certainty of the benefit to the fisheries, the answer is no certainty. A shrug of a shoulder. Really? I can quantify the harm to myself and PID water users. I can quantify them with facts and hard numbers. Numbers that I welcome a challenge by the State Board. I was raised not to be respectful, to be disrespectful, especially with authority. But when I'm kicked in the teeth, you can expect some spit on your shoes. My ask is that the State Board reconsider their previous decision and let us work together to bring balance and sanity to this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there further questions? Thank you very much for coming and illuminating this issue for us, and I know you'll be talking. You asked your questions here, but
Thank you very much.
to the extent that something can be done, we will.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We appreciate the time.
And next we have the South of Delta Water User Panel. 7 of you on the list. I have Ara Azarian. Oh, sorry. Ara, I see you. You're here. Peter Riekert, Lon Martin, Chris White, Rick Ortega, Cindy Cow, and Bill Diedrich. Janine, the timer wasn't on for that last one. Are you turning the timer on? Oh, that doesn't really help. You all know how to. We don't have the board. All right. All right. I haven't been hearing that. I'll just. Okay. All right. Hi, all. I'm sure you've organized yourselves. We got 7 speakers and an hour scheduled, and so I'm sure you've figured it out. The folks behind you will be grateful if you take less than an hour, but thank you for your patience.
We will be as quick as we can
I
be.
see you all.
Madam Chairman, thank you for the opportunity. Board members, we appreciate the time allotment. My name's R. Ashdarian. I'm with the San Luis and Delta Mendota Water Authority. We're here today with representatives of every sector of the region that we serve. For a little bit of background, San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority serves 28 member agencies that all receive some portion of their water from the Central Valley Project, appropriated and stored in the north, conveyed at Jones Pumping Plant in the Delta, and delivered for agricultural, municipal, and environmental management purposes. Today with me we've got, we have Chris White, General Manager of the Central California Irrigation District, representing the exchange contractors. We have Rick Ortega, General Manager of the Grassland Water District, representing the Wildlife Refuges Complex interspersed among the exchange contractors. We have Peter Reichert from Patterson Irrigation District, representing the Upper DMC region. We have Lon Martin from San Luis Water District, representing the San Luis unit. We have Cindy Gao from Santa Clara Valley Water District, representing the municipal and industrial concerns. And we have Bill Dietrich representing agricultural interests, the family farmer voice in the San Joaquin Valley. We will try our best.
No, I don't mean to hurt. I mean, all of you could take a lot of time, and you represent a lot of people, so I didn't mean to rush you.
Yeah, no worries.
Serving the room.
If I'm going too fast or start using acronyms, throw a shoot at me. I'll slow down. So, you know, we're here today. It's very difficult circumstances. We understand that. The realities are grim. We do deeply appreciate the significant efforts that your staff at Reclamation, DWR, the fish agencies have gone through, unprecedented effort, good collaboration, and just, you know, terrible circumstances, a lot of Sophie's choices we're dealing with. We understand that, and we've been, you know, having to deal with those south of the Delta for quite some time. To illustrate some of the sectors that are, you know, affected by all of this, you know, we've got technology, we've got wildlife refuges, and we have agriculture. With respect to the question of what comes next after this temperature management plan revision occurs, 7 out of the top 10 ag-producing counties in the nation will be affected by that answer. So it's not insignificant what is about ready to occur for agriculture throughout not only the state, but the nation as well. Agriculture throughout the region, going to Ms. Diadama's question earlier, did make significant investments based on the framework agreement that was announced by the 5 agencies in the middle of April, ultimately by the provisional approval of the more detailed version of that agreement made mid-May. Tens of thousands of individual, independent, and irreversible decisions have been made, and folks on the panel will be able to get to those much more clearly. The world that we've been living in is a world that's been very deeply impacted by regulation over the last 20 years. The environment we live in now, notwithstanding the current accentuation of the regulatory drought by a real drought, has led to our ag service contractors receiving a 0% supply for 2 years in a row. Our refuge managers receiving less than an adequate supply 2 years in a row, and our prior rights holders receiving less than is obligated to them 2 years in a row as well. So the situation south of the Delta has been dire, and yet, despite that, this community is pulled together. And Mr. Moore, you had, you know, begun the day with with observations about the need for community and neighborliness, collaboration, and we couldn't agree with you more. I think a lot of the most difficult decisions, the most difficult problems we've faced along the way since this all began, frankly, we went into drought planning mode in the summer of 2013 when we first forecast a 2014 0% egg supply for egg service contractors. So we've been at it for quite some time, and we would note that at every step along the way, the cooperation of public water agencies, the districts, the farmers, has been an essential part of every solution that we've seen. And they need to continue to be an essential part moving forward. So, you know, what does it all come down to? The question was coming up here a little bit ago about what are the impacts, and we have some estimates here about those. The difficulty with these numbers or any numbers is, you know, how are they formulated? And the numbers that represent this range here between, you know, 3.9 billion to, you know, north of 4.9 billion is an amalgamation of estimates that were generated in a day based on a request from Reclamation to try and understand what's the magnitude. And getting back to Ms. Diadama's question earlier, yes, this isn't talking about the acreage that's been fallowed and the financial implications of that to the growers, to the county's tax base, to farm workers and the communities that support them. These are the acres that are at risk because of the decisions that have been made along the way based on prior decisions.
But can you help me just so that I really want, these numbers are so big, I want to understand what they are. Are they the drought this year, or are they based on this extra increment of the 250,000 acre feet of water?
The extra increment of the 250,000 acre feet of water, and what folks were looking at here is the range since just recently we had, you know, a target number presented to us. At the time that these numbers were contemplated, there was still discussion of a range. And so if it was 8,000 CFS, what might that look like? And we're closer to the 3.9 number. And if it's the 7,000 CFS, we're closer to the 4.9 number. And we've landed a little bit in between with the 7,250 target that's now before us. But you know, the numbers are what they are. I think what's more important than the numbers in absolute terms is the ramifications of no pumping at the Delta if that is to occur. And folks will be able to speak to that in far more detail than I can. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to this question of risk and how do we manage it. We recognize that, you know, the fish are in a horrible situation. Last year's survival numbers are unacceptable, and we must do more to manage that situation better, and that is being done. We certainly strongly support DFW's, Department of Fish and Wildlife's efforts to do more non-flow interventions. Clearly we're in unprecedented times, and all tools need to be brought to bear. We wish their enthusiasm and creativity in that regard was shared more widely, but we certainly are in full support of that. But at the end of the day, what we do know and what I don't find helpful is sort of the shrill concern about extinction. Last year's numbers were awful, but they were not a complete loss. This year's numbers are likely to be better, and we do have in place, of course, the hatchery management that both NIMS and the Department of Fish and Wildlife, National Marine Fisheries Service, and Department of Fish and Wildlife have wisely implemented. And while it's not an ideal situation, it is another management tool, just like utilizing water in Shasta is a management tool. And so is the situation dire? Certainly. Is it an absolute catastrophe? No, not yet, and people are working damn hard to make sure it doesn't become one. Ironically, where the risk then shifts for that solution is to the people who planned best to manage their risk, and that comes down to the individual farmers and communities, water districts that acquired water to manage their risk, which are now at risk of not being able to utilize that water, either because it can't be delivered from Shasta or it's being borrowed in San Luis Water District with in San Luis Reservoir with an uncertain prospect of payback in the future. The ability for folks to go out, to be neighborly, to be collaborative, to do the sorts of exchanges, transfers, purchase, most complicated sort of delivery schemes that you can possibly imagine is reliant on that water being where it needs to be at the time it needs to be there. And so the ability to deliver water that's being reserved in Shasta now for temperature management as we move through the summer, the need to move that water as soon as possible is paramount. If we see additional water accumulating in Shasta, or if we get to a point where temperatures hopefully are running lower than forecast, at whatever opportunities exist, time is of the essence, and that water needs to move or things will unravel quite quickly. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we really have three asks, and they're very simple. One is just a simple invitation for public water agencies to be an integral part of this emergency management. We have unique, we have the ability to develop resources that are unique. We have the ability to adjust demands that are unique. We have the ability to provide expertise that is unique, whether it's biologists, hydrologists, operators. We also have unique, and at least in terms of the drought operations team or the emergency management team that's being complicated, we have unique and unrepresented responsibilities to the public, whether they be fiduciary, explaining to our ratepayers why they may not have water or why their rates are going up as a function of the drought and so forth. So we have mandated legal obligations that are different than other interested parties. Our second ask, and this is the most important of them all, is that the water being reserved now for temperature management be released as soon as possible. And if that's August, great. If that's September, fine. But we need to start moving that as soon as possible so that the borrowing that's going on now and the communal sort of arrangements that are being made can be fully realized. And then lastly, you know, and I know you all are working very hard towards this, but this is something that we have to, in all communities, be able to do. We got to facilitate agreeable outcomes. We can't get ourselves in a situation where, you know, there's mostly agreement and then, oh no, I can't live with that last little part and everything comes unraveled. We don't have time for that. The situation is way too dire for that. And so we really need to be working towards the common good. And so I think everyone on this panel has bent over backwards trying to achieve that. I know everyone sitting here today holds that spirit, and so I'll stop there and let others pick up. I think next we'll pick up with Mr. White. Chris.